You have until sunrise." The Duke of Ravensmore did not raise his voice when he said it. That was the worst of it. A shout she could have braced against, the way one braces against weather. But Julian Hartley delivered her ruin in the same flat tone a man might use to dismiss a footman, standing in the doorway of his own great hall with the rain coming down behind her in the dark, and Rosalind Carrow understood at once that he meant it. "Your Grace," she began, "there is no carriage until morning, I am told, and the village is 4 miles in the wrong direction across open moor. I am aware. You may sit by the fire in the servants' hall until the sky greys, and then you will be gone from Ravensmore, and you will not return. Mrs. Dunmore will see you to the gate." He had not once looked fully at her. He looked at a point just beyond her shoulder, as though the sight of an unfamiliar woman in his house were a thing he could decline to permit. "Whatever business brought you, it is finished. I receive no one. I have not for 5 years, and I do not intend to begin with a stranger off the Pickering Road." Behind him the hall stretched away into shadow, vast and cold as a church, and at the foot of the staircase stood a tall case clock, with its hands stopped at 11 minutes past 9. Rosalind did not move toward the servants' hall. She set down her father's battered leather case on the flagstones, the case she had carried 200 miles and would not let out of her grip, and she lowered herself onto the long oak settle just inside the door. She folded her wet hands in her lap. She looked up at him then and held it. "I'll wait here, I think," she said. "Thank you, Your Grace." The housekeeper made a small sound. The Duke went very still. For 5 years no one had told the Duke of Ravensmore no. His grief had become a kind of law. The household moved around it the way a river moves around a stone, and the stone never learns that it is being avoided. He looked at her properly for the first time, and what he saw was a young woman of 24, soaked to the knee, her chin lifted, who had just declined his command as though it were a second helping of soup. "You misunderstand me," he said. "I understood you entirely," Rosalind answered. "You have given me until sunrise. It is not yet 10 o'clock. I intend to use the hours." What she did not say, what she had carried 200 miles in the leather case and would not surrender until she had laid it in his hands and not a servant's, was the thing that had brought her. She let him wonder, let him stand there in his own doorway, furious and arrested, a man who had forgotten what it was to be refused, and not know yet that the stranger on his settle had come to tell him how his wife had died. She would tell him before the clock, that did not move, had moved at all. The Duke turned on his heel and was gone into the dark of the house, and the only answer she received was a door, somewhere far off, closing. Mrs. Dunmore approached slowly, a candle cupped in one weathered hand. She was a broad grey woman of 60, with a face built for kindness that had plainly been out of practice. "You ought to do as he says, child," she murmured. "You don't know what he is when he's crossed." "I know exactly what he is," Rosalind said quietly. "He is a man who has confused being left alone with being at peace. They are not the same thing, Mrs. Dunmore. I have nursed enough of the dying to know the difference." The candle trembled. The old woman studied her, the travelling cloak gone to mud at the hem, the steadiness that did not match the youth of the face, and something in her seemed to decide. "You'd best have a dry shawl then," she said, "if you mean to be stubborn at him all night." The hall was the cruelest cold Rosalind had ever sat in, and it was June. The fires had not been lit in the public rooms in years. She could see the grates standing swept and empty as she looked down the long gallery, a house kept like a tomb by a man who could not bring himself to either live in it or leave. The only warmth came from a small fire Mrs. Dunmore coaxed up in the hall grate, more from defiance than instruction, and Rosalind drew the borrowed shawl about her shoulders and watched the stopped clock and waited. He came back at 11. She heard him before she saw him, the uneven tread, the faint drag of the right boot that he had spent 12 years training out of his walk and never quite managed. He came down the gallery with a branch of candles, and he set it on the table near her with a hard click, and he said, "You are still here. I told you I would be. People say a great many things. I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean." She looked up at him. The candlelight had found him now where the doorway had kept him in silhouette, and she saw the truth of him for the first time. Not the monster the inns along the road had promised, the cold duke they'd whispered, The one who buried his wife and his heart in the same grave, mind you. Don't take the Ravensmore work. He'll freeze the marrow in you. But a man of 35, worn thin as a coat turned twice. Dark eyes, near to black, with the bruised look of a man who did not sleep. A streak of premature white at the left temple. And across the back of his right hand, raised and pale, a long scar that he turned, unconsciously, away from the light. She noticed it the way you notice a held breath. She did not look away from it, and she did not stare. She simply let her gaze rest on the scar a moment, and then returned to his face, without flinching and without pity, and the Duke saw her do it, and something crossed his features that he could not govern in time. That was the thing he would think of afterward, not her defiance, the way she had looked at the worst of him and had not made it into a question. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was nearer to bewilderment. "No, Your Grace. Everyone is afraid of me. It is the one thing I have left that functions reliably." "Then it must be very lonely," Rosalind said, "to be a thing that works." The Duke set his jaw. He was unused to being spoken to as though he were a man and not a weather front, and he did not yet know whether he wished to have her thrown bodily into the rain or to sit down on the settle beside her and ask her how she had learned to look at a scar like that. He did neither. He stood over her, rigid, the candle branch throwing his shadow up the wall to twice his height. "Why are you here?" he said. "And do not tell me about a broken carriage. You came to my gate on purpose. The driver had instruction. What do you want of me? Money? A position? Some claim my cousin will have to buy off in the morning?" "I want nothing of you," she said. "I have come to give you something." "I want nothing." "I know. That is rather the trouble with you." She reached for the leather case. 5 years ago, in the November of 1812, the Duchess of Ravensmore died of a fever that began in her lungs and went to her blood. She was attended in her final week by a physician brought up from London because the local man had given her over. That physician was my father, Dr. Edmund Carow. The branch of candles came down onto the table, so hard that 2 of them guttered out. "Stop," the Duke said. "I was 19. I assisted him. I was in the room. Stop." "She asked for paper on the last night she was lucid," Rosalind went on, steady, though her own hands had begun at last to shake. "And my father gave it to her, and she wrote you a letter. She made him swear to put it into your hands and no one else's. He swore it. And then the fever took her 2 days later, and the house went to chaos and grief, and your cousin Mr. Thorne managed everything, and managed my father out of the door with his fee before the letter could be delivered. And my father—" Her voice caught, and she mastered it. "My father carried that broken oath for 4 years. He died last spring, still ashamed of it. I found the letter sewn into the lining of his case when I was clearing his rooms. He never delivered it because he was turned away. So I have come to deliver it, because I am the only one left who swore nothing, and so the only one free to keep his word." She drew it out. A single folded sheet, the wax seal long since cracked grey, the ink gone the colour of old tea. On the outside, in a fine sloping hand, 4 words: "To my husband, Julian." The Duke of Ravensmore looked at his dead wife's handwriting across 5 years of silence, and for one moment Rosalind watched the entire architecture of the man, the cold, the height, the law of his grief, simply cease to bear weight. "That is not possible," he whispered. "She did not. There was nothing. She slept and then she did not wake. They told me she said nothing at the end." "She said a great deal," Rosalind said softly. "They simply did not give it to you." He did not take the letter. He stepped back from it as though it were live coal. "Who told you to do this?" he said, and the cold was rushing back into him now, because cold was the only thing that had ever held. "Thorne. This is Thorne's doing. Some forgery. Some scheme of his too. Your Grace, your cousin is exactly why it was never delivered. You will leave. Now. Sunrise be damned, you will." "I will not," Rosalind said, and rose to her feet, and they stood a yard apart in the freezing hall with the dead woman's letter between them. "You may put me out into the rain with your own hands if you wish it. You are a duke. No magistrate will trouble you for it. But I will stand at your gate in the dark until they do. and I will tell every soul on the Pickering Road that the Duke of Ravensmore threw a physician's daughter onto the moor sooner than read his wife's last words. I did not carry this letter 200 miles to hand it to a footman. I will give it to you, tonight. That is the whole of what I came to do, and I am not afraid of you, and I am not leaving until it is done. The fire snapped in the grate. Far above them, the house creaked in the wind. You speak to me, the Duke said slowly, as though I were an ordinary man. I have not yet met the man who wasn't under the title, she said. I have met a great many who hoped the title would excuse them from it. It landed like a blade slipped clean between two ribs. No blood at first, only the cold knowledge that something vital had been reached. The Duke's face changed. For the first time he looked not furious, but found out, and a man who has been hiding for 5 years does not forgive easily the person who locates him. Leave the letter on the table, he said, very low, and do not speak to me again tonight. He took the candle branch and left her there. But he did not, she noticed, tell her again to go. And he had not, she noticed, taken the letter, but neither had he forbidden it to remain. She set it on the oak table beneath the dead candles, where he would have to pass it to climb his own stairs, and she sat back down, and she waited. The clock said 11 minutes past 9. It had said so for 5 years. Toward 1 in the morning, Mrs. Dunmore came again, this time with bread and dripping and a cup of small beer, and sat heavily on the settle beside Rosalind, as though her legs had at last refused the argument with her conscience. He stopped that clock himself, the old woman said without being asked, nodding at the silent case in the dark. The night she went, 11 past 9, that's the hour the breathing stopped. He took the key and he wound the pendulum to a stand, and he's kept it so. We're none of us allowed to touch it. Maid started it once by accident, dusting. He didn't shout. He just looked at it ticking like it was an insult. Like time had got up and walked off without his leave. She wiped her hands on her apron. 5 years that house has had no hour in it. You can't keep a soul alive in a place where it's always the same minute, child. I've watched him not move from it. And now you come with... She glanced at the letter on the table, with her hand on a page. I don't know whether you've saved him or finished him. Neither do I, Rosalind admitted. But he had a right to it. A man cannot grieve honestly what he was never allowed to hear. You talk like your father was a wise man. He was a guilty one, she said. Sometimes they sound the same. She must have slept, despite herself, despite the cold, for she woke with a start in the grey-black hour when the night is oldest, the fire down to embers, the shawl slipped from her shoulder, and the Duke of Ravensmore was sitting in the chair across the dead grate from her, the letter open in his 2 hands, and he was weeping without any sound at all. She did not move. She had nursed the dying and sat with the bereaved, and she knew that there are moments a person must be permitted to believe they are unwitnessed even when they are not. So she lay still and kept her breathing even, and let him have it. The long silent shaking, the tears running into the white streak of his beard where he had not shaved, the way he pressed the back of his scarred hand to his mouth to keep even the grief obedient. When he had done, he spoke without looking up, and she understood he had known she was awake the whole time. She forgave me, he said. I have spent 5 years certain that the last thing she knew of me was that I was not there. I was riding. I was 3 hours away buying a horse I did not need, because I could not bear to sit in the room and watch her go, and I told myself I would be back by evening and there would be time. There was not time. She died while I was on the road, choosing between a grey and a bay. His voice was wrecked, scraped down to the boards. And she knew. She knew I had run. And she wrote. He could not finish it. He turned the page toward the ember's light and read it instead, in a whisper, the way a man reads scripture he no longer believes but cannot stop reciting. You were never made for sick rooms, my dear cold love. Do not punish yourself with a vigil I would not have wanted. Be kind to the horse. Be kinder to yourself. And for the love I die still holding, do not turn this house into my grave. Live in it. Let the clocks run. The fire ticked. Outside, very faintly, the first bird of the morning tried a note and thought better of it. Let the clocks run, he repeated. and looked up at last, and his black eyes in the grey light were a boy's. She told me to let the clocks run, and I stopped the only one in the hall the same night, and I have stood guard over a single minute for 5 years like a fool, and you came here on a broken oath of a dead man, and you sat in my freezing hall, and you would not go, and you gave me the one thing. His breath went ragged again. Why would you not go? Any sane creature would have gone. Because I have watched what unfinished things do to people, Rosalind said. My father carried one for 4 years and it killed more of him than the consumption did. I was not going to let you carry yours a day longer than the night I could reach you. That is all. I am sorry it cost you this. I am not sorry I came. The Duke of Ravensmore looked at her across the cold hearth in the oldest hour of the night, and what he felt was not gratitude, which is a manageable thing, but the far more dangerous beginning of being known. And he leaned forward, and she did not lean back, and for the length of a held breath there was less than a hand's width of air between his mouth and hers, and the whole house seemed to tilt toward that small dark distance. The great door-knocker fell 3 times like cannon. They broke apart. Outside, a voice was already shouting through the wood, brisk and gentleman pleased with himself. And Rosalind watched every soft thing the night had pried open in the Duke's face slam shut again behind iron. "Cousin," the voice called. "Cousin, it's Thorn. I had your steward's note. Dear God, what's this about a woman at the gate? A scandal at this hour. Open up, before the whole of Yorkshire is talking." It was not yet dawn, but it was near. Mr. Ambrose Thorn came in out of the wet on a gust of cold air and false warmth, a heavy, handsome man of 41 in a many-caped greatcoat, snapping orders for candles before he was 3 steps inside. Behind him, hanging back in the doorway with the embarrassed stoop of a man who knows he has been brought to do something distasteful, stood a thin grey gentleman in black with a leather portfolio under his arm. "There she is," said Thorn, finding Rosalind by the dead grate. He did not look at her long. He looked at her the way one looks at a problem already solved. A young woman alone, the whole night in a bachelor duke's house. You see, Pelham? You see precisely the disorder I have been describing to you for 2 years. My poor cousin cannot be left to manage so much as his own front door. He turned to the Duke with a sorrow so well oiled it nearly passed for real. Julian, look at the state of you. Wept out and unshaven and entertaining vagrants before sunrise. This cannot go on. You know it cannot. I have brought Mr. Pelham of the Chancery, a magistrate's man, only to make a quiet record, only to protect you. To have me declared, the Duke said, non compos mentis. The word landed in the cold hall and sat there. To have you cared for, Thorn corrected gently. A commission of lunacy is not a punishment, cousin. It is a mercy. The estate placed in trust, in steady hands, your debts and your decisions managed by someone who loves you, until such time as you are recovered. I should never forgive myself if I let pride keep me from doing what your dear late mother would have begged me to do. His eyes flicked, finally and fully, to Rosalind, and the warmth went out of them entirely. And this creature, whoever she is, will of course be removed. A girl who spends the night unchaperoned with a peer is not a witness anyone need trouble to hear. And there it was, the whole of his scheme laid bare in a breath, so smooth he did not know he had shown it. If the Duke never married, never produced a son, and could be tucked into a comfortable madness, then Ambrose Thorn, heir presumptive, would hold Ravensmore and its 14,000 a year in trust now and in name forever. 5 years he had fed the grief. 5 years he had kept the house a tomb because a tomb has no heirs. Every year you mourn, cousin, his whole soft, careful life had been saying, is another year the estate falls quietly to me. Rosalind stood up. Mr. Pelham, she said, before Thorn could turn the room. Before you make your quiet record, you should know who I am and what I have in this case. You will be silent, Thorn snapped. I am Rosalind Carow, daughter of Dr. Edmund Carow, who attended the late Duchess in her final illness in 1812. She had the leather case open on the oak table now, her hands quick and certain, the hands of a woman who had assisted at deathbeds and did not faint at hard moments. My father kept records of everything, sir. It was his curse, and now it is your inconvenience. He kept the Duchess's last letter, which the Duke read not an hour ago, in his late wife's own hand, which any soul who knew her may verify. Does that read to you like a letter written to a madman, or like a wife who trusted her husband's mind absolutely? And he kept these. She drew out a second packet, bound in faded red tape. His accounts of the household in those weeks. He was paid, you see, Mr. Thorne, by drafts on the Ravensmore estate, and he was a meticulous man, and he kept the counterfoils. 3 of them bear the Duke's signature. She laid them in the candlelight, side by side, and they do not match. 2 are the Duke's hand. The third, the largest, sir, £900, is a forgery, and a poor one beside the others. And it is drawn to the account of a Mr. A. Thorne. My father noticed. He noted it in the margin, in his own hand, dated, and he was paid off and turned out of this house the very next morning before he could say a word of it to a grieving man who would not have heard him anyway. She lifted her chin. You did not keep the Duke from marrying, sir. You kept him from waking up. Because the day he woke, he would do his own sums. The thin grey magistrate's man had gone very still over his portfolio. He set it down, unopened, and reached instead for the counterfoils. You little. Thorne started toward her, and the Duke of Ravensmore stepped between them. He did not raise his voice. He had not, in the whole of that long night, raised his voice once, and he did not now. And that was what made the room go silent to its corners. Mr. Pelham, said the Duke, you will examine those 3 drafts at your leisure, and you will examine the estate ledgers, which my cousin has kept these 5 years, and which I, in my convenient grief, have not once asked to see. I expect you will find the gap between them is several £1,000s wide, and shaped exactly like a man in a great many capes. He turned. Ambrose, you came to this house to call me mad in front of a magistrate, because a madman cannot prosecute his cousin for theft. You very nearly managed it. I will give you that. For 5 years you managed me beautifully. You fed me my own grief with a spoon and told me it was medicine. His scarred hand was perfectly steady at his side. My wife asked me to let the clocks run, and you have spent 5 years making certain they never did, because the moment they did I would count the hours and then I would count the money. Get out of my house. Mr. Pelham will know where to find you. He has your address. It is on the back of a draft for £900 that was never yours. Ambrose Thorne looked from the Duke to the magistrate's man, who had already drawn the forged counterfoil close to the candle, and was frowning at it with the particular hunger of an honest clerk who has found a dishonest sum. And the handsome certainty drained out of him all at once, leaving a heavy frightened man in a wet coat who had badly miscalculated the hour. You have no idea what you are doing, he said. Without me this estate falls apart in a 12-month. You cannot run it. You cannot even run a clock. Then it is fortunate, the Duke said, that I have just engaged someone who can read a ledger better than either of us. He did not look at Rosalind when he said it. He did not have to. The whole room understood whom he meant, and so did she. Pelham gathered the counterfoils with careful fingers. Mr. Thorne, he said quietly, I think you had best come with me to make a very different sort of record than the one we discussed in the carriage. And he took the heavy man by the arm, gently, the way Thorne himself had pretended to take the Duke, and steered him out into the grey, and the great door of Ravensmore closed on the both of them. And outside it, beyond the windows of the cold hall, the black of the moor had gone to charcoal, and the charcoal was going, at its eastern edge, to the first thin pewter of a Yorkshire dawn. They were alone. Mrs. Dunmore had withdrawn to the kitchen passage with the discretion of 40 years' service, and the broad satisfaction of a woman who has watched the right thing happen at last. The fire was nothing but warm ash, and the Duke of Ravensmore turned from the door to face the woman who had refused, all night, to leave it. You knew, he said, when you sat down on that settle at 10 o'clock and would not move. You knew the drafts were forged. You knew what he was. You could have told me the moment I opened the door. You would not have heard me, Rosalind said. An hour ago you thought the letter itself was his forgery. A grieving man believes nothing, and a waking man believes everything. I had to wait for you to come up between the two. I could not give you the proof until you could bear to be sane, so I gave you your wife first. She looked at him steadily, though her exhaustion was beginning to show now, the long night and the long road catching her all at once. Your Grace, stop looking at me as though I rescued you. I did not. I handed you a letter and some old paper and refused to pour command. You counted the hours. You put yourself between him and me. You will prosecute your own cousin and run your own house, and you will be the one to start that clock. I only would not leave the room. Do not make me the heroine of a thing you did yourself. Stop, he said, but it was not the cold stop of the night before. He crossed the cold flags to her, and he took her hand, the chapped, ink-stained, deathbed-steady hand that had carried a leather case 200 miles to keep a dead man's broken word, and he held it in both of his as though it were the only warm thing in a house with 5 years of winter in it. You have undone me, he said, low and unguarded, the title gone from his voice entirely, only the man left. You came to my door to do one decent thing and be gone by sunrise, and instead you have given me back my wife's forgiveness, and my own mind and very probably my fortune, all before the sun was up, and asked for none of it. And I find, God help me, I find I cannot let you walk out to that gate. Not because you are a fortune I need managed, because the house has been the same minute for 5 years, Rosalind, and you walked in and made it an hour again. I do not know how to be a living man, but I think I would like to learn it where you can see me do it. Stay, not until sunrise, past it. The pewter light had reached the eastern windows now, and laid itself in long pale bars across the flagstones of the hall, across the dead grate, across the silent case clock at the foot of the stairs. Rosalind Carrow looked at the man who had given her one night to be gone, and who was now asking her, with his whole broken open face, for every dawn after this one. And she did not answer him with words. She turned his scarred right hand over in hers, the hand he had spent the night keeping from the light, and she pressed her mouth to the old pale ridge of it, gently, without flinching, exactly as she had looked at it the night before. And then he kissed her, not gently, like a man surfacing, like the release of a pressure 5 years deep, one hand coming up to her jaw, and the other still gripping hers as though she might yet be a thing that worked only until morning. And she rose into it and gave it back, and the cold hall was not cold. And somewhere in the kitchen passage, Mrs. Dunmore decided very firmly that she had heard nothing at all. When they broke apart, the sun was fully up. The Duke of Ravensmore walked, still holding her hand, to the foot of the stairs. He drew from his waistcoat a small brass key he had carried 5 years against his heart and never once used. He opened the door of the tall case clock, and he reached in, and with 2 fingers he set the heavy pendulum swinging. The clock began, after 5 years, to tick. 11 minutes past 9, he said, watching the hands stand free at last. I shall have to set it forward. We are hours past that now. Hours and hours, Rosalind agreed. A year and some months later, it was the following October, with the moor gone to bronze and the fires lit in every grate of a house that had finally remembered it was meant to be lived in. The Duchess of Ravensmore stood in the warm hall and listened to the clock chime the half-hour, which it did, now reliably, having been wound every Sunday by her own hand. Ambrose Thorne had been tried at the York Assizes for forgery and embezzlement against the estate, found guilty on the evidence of 3 counterfoils and a dead physician's careful margins, stripped of every expectation, and shipped quietly to a cousin in the Canadas with an allowance just large enough to keep him there, and far too small to let him forget why. He troubled them no further. On the table beneath the running clock lay an open letter. Not the old one. That one was framed now, in the Duke's study, in the late Duchess Cordelia's sloping hand. Let the clocks run. This was a new letter, in a child's careful first attempt at script, from a goddaughter in the village school the new Duchess had endowed. Rosalind read it twice, and laughed, and looked up to find her husband watching her from the gallery the way he had watched her that first cold night. Except that there was no winter left in him at all now, only the dark eyes gone warm, and the white streak at his temple she had grown to love because it was the one part of his grief he had agreed to keep. You were smiling at me, he said, coming down, as though I were an ordinary man. I never have managed to meet the man you aren't under the title, she said, though God knows I've looked. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped beside the clock that told the true and present hour, and he took her ink-stained hand in his scarred one, and the morning went on around them, full of running time. exactly as a dead woman had asked that it should.